Muddy streets filled with hungry citizens sat just a carriage ride away from the brightly lit, gilded hallways of the royal palace. French society operated under the estate system, a rigid legal hierarchy. The Catholic clergy and the nobility made up the first and second estates, comprising barely 2% of the total population. The remaining 98% formed the third estate. They carried the national tax burden and produced the country's wealth, yet were excluded from political power. Queen Marie Antoinette became the public face of this royal disconnect. To a starving public, the extravagant cost of her wardrobe and powdered wigs symbolized a monarchy insulated from the suffering of its people. This hierarchy was fixed by birth. A laborer or peasant could not work their way out of the third estate. With no mechanism for upward mobility, social fracture was guaranteed. By the late 1780s, the French crown was functionally bankrupt. Decades of deficit spending, compounded by the massive cost of funding the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. This table outlines France's debt in 1789. Debt service consumed more than half the annual budget, leaving little to run the country. Attempts to solve this crisis failed. The nobility blocked every proposal to tax their land, prioritizing tax exemptions over national solvency. At the same time, Enlightenment philosophers were circulating new texts through the salons and streets of Paris, arguing that governments exist to serve the people. The traditional belief in the divine right of kings was directly challenged by the concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that authority comes solely from the governed. The collision of total state bankruptcy with these new intellectual frameworks turned a standard fiscal crisis into a direct threat to the absolute monarchy. In the summer of 1789, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General to address the financial crisis. Negotiations quickly gridlocked, and the deputies of the Third Estate arrived at their assembly hall to find the doors locked and guarded by royal soldiers. Undeterred, the commoners relocated to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they defied the king, declared themselves the true National Assembly, and swore an oath not to disband until they had drafted a new constitution. Fearing a military crackdown, the citizens of Paris armed themselves. On July 14th, a desperate crowd marched on the Bastille and violently breached the heavy wooden gates of the medieval fortress. Their strategic objective was the 250 barrels of gunpowder stored inside. After a chaotic and bloody siege, the fortress fell, and the governor's severed head was paraded through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille crossed a point of no return. A political dispute over taxes and representation had escalated into a lethal popular revolt against royal rule. Weeks later, the National Assembly codified their philosophical victory by drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The document dismantled the legal structure of aristocratic privilege, asserting boldly that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. But the king refused to accept a diminished role. His failed attempt to flee the country in disguise shattered whatever public trust remained, eventually resulting in the abolition of the monarchy and his execution by guillotine. Into this power vacuum stepped Maximilien Robespierre. He believed that a true democracy required citizens of perfect moral virtue, a quality he felt the French people severely lacked. Driven by this demand for ideological purity, Robespierre and the National Convention instituted a severe state crackdown that became known as the Reign of Terror. State-sanctioned violence was deployed systematically. The guillotine was used to execute tens of thousands of citizens accused of being enemies of the revolution. In their desperate pursuit of absolute liberty and ideological purity, the revolutionaries constructed a paranoid and murderous regime. The Reign of Terror eventually collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind a dangerous power vacuum and a fractured nation. Order was ultimately restored by a highly regimented military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte, who stepped into the chaos to consolidate absolute power. Napoleon institutionalized many of the revolution's core principles through the Napoleonic Code, establishing a legal society based on meritocracy rather than aristocratic birthright. The shockwaves of French liberalism spread across the continent. The creation of French-aligned sister republics introduced new legal rights to neighboring populations, while terrifying conservative monarchs. Although it concluded in a dictatorship, the revolution dismantled the centuries-old legal concept of divine right. It established the modern political reality that governments possess authority only to serve the people.